When I asked my stepson to unzip my dress, I was amazed that such a simple moment would linger so vividly in my mind. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where time stretches and mundane tasks take on a strange sense of significance. The house was unusually still, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound to punctuate the silence. I had decided to sort through my closet, something I'd been meaning to do for weeks but kept putting off. Maybe I was searching for a distraction, something to fill the void of another long day spent alone. My fingers danced across the racks, and there it was, a sleek black dress nestled among the clutter. I pulled it out, its fabric smooth and luxurious against my fingertips. It had been years since I had last worn it. The zipper glinted under the soft light, almost teasing me with a reminder of who I used to be. A woman confident, alluring, unafraid to claim attention. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror, feeling a strange pull to recapture that version of myself, if only for a moment. Without a second thought, I slipped off my robe and pulled the dress over my body. The fabric embraced me in a way that felt both exotic and nostalgic, highlighting the curves I had once overlooked. As I adjusted the straps, I reached behind me to zip it up, but the zipper resisted, catching just below the small of my back. I gave it another tug, this time with more gusto, but it remained obstinate. I felt a surge of excitement as I adjusted the straps, eager to embrace the sensation of the dress enveloping my body. I contemplated removing the dress, yet it had stirred within me a curiosity and a longing to perceive myself as more than just my everyday self. But my arms strained, and the zipper stayed stubbornly in place. A soft laugh escaped my lips, tinged with exasperation. Of all the times to have a wardrobe malfunction. Then it hit me. Caleb was upstairs. My stepson, home from college, had been quietly occupying the guest room for the summer. The thought of calling him made my pulse quicken, and I felt a surge of excitement. It seemed innocent enough, a simple request for help. Yet, as I stood there, half-dressed and vulnerable, I felt a surge of excitement. Was it embarrassment? Was it self-consciousness? I couldn't tell, but there was no other option. "Caleb," I called out, my voice steady but soft, resonating down the hallway. I heard his footsteps descending the stairs, each one deliberate and unhurried. When he appeared in the doorway, his eyes widened slightly as they took in the scene. There I stood, the dress clinging to me, the zipper stuck halfway up, exposing the expanse of my bare back. His gaze flickered to my face, then back down, and for a split second, an unspoken tension filled the air. "Hey," I said, attempting a casual smile. "Hey, can you help me with this? The zipper's stuck." He paused, his hand gently rubbing the back of his neck. "Absolutely. Yeah, of course." I turned, presenting my back to him, and immediately felt the warmth of his presence as he stepped closer. The room felt like an intimate space, the air thick with anticipation. His fingers brushed against my skin as he reached for the zipper, sending a thrilling shiver through me. It wasn't just the physical touch. It was the awareness of being seen, of his undivided attention. "It's really stuck," he said, his voice low and alluring. He tugged gently, and I felt the dress shift slightly against my body, adding to the anticipation. "Just pull a little harder," I said, though my voice came out softer than I intended. His hand moved to the back of my body, his fingertips lightly tracing the edge of the fabric. Every small movement felt amplified, like a ripple across the surface of calm waters. My heart was beating faster now, and I felt the rush of heat that crept up my neck. It was ridiculous, really. This was Caleb, practically a kid. But there was something in the way his touch lingered, something that felt intentional. The zipper yielded to the gentle pull, releasing a soft metallic sound as it did so. "There," he said, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. I turned to face him, pulling the straps back onto my shoulders. "Thank you," I said, my voice still soft, but with a depth I hadn't expected. He nodded, and our eyes met for a long, lingering moment. "No problem," he said. As he turned to leave, I caught myself watching him, noticing things I hadn't before. The sharp line of his jaw, the way he moved with a quiet confidence. I shook my head, attempting to banish those thoughts. It was nothing but a trivial moment exaggerated by my overactive mind. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the way my body felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. I felt a surge of energy, a spark of something I couldn't quite identify. Deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. If I had known then where that moment would lead, maybe I would have acted differently, but I'm just happy to have had this experience. Or maybe I wouldn't have. But one thing was certain. The lines between us were no longer as clear as they once seemed. The days following that afternoon were marked by a strange undercurrent I couldn't quite place, and I was excited to see where it would lead. It wasn't the events that lingered, but the emotions they stirred. I found myself replaying that moment over and over in my mind, as though searching for something hidden in the details. His hesitant fingers, the brief but deliberate brush of his hands against my skin, the way he had looked at me afterward. It wasn't just a memory. It was a sensation that clung to me, refusing to fade. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment born of circumstance, a simple misunderstanding of signals. But the truth was harder to dismiss. I felt noticed, seen in a way I hadn't been in years. My husband, James, had become so distant lately, consumed by his work and oblivious to the woman I still was beneath the layers of routine and responsibility. That single stolen moment had awakened something I wasn't prepared to confront, a longing I thought I'd buried long ago. Caleb, on the other hand, seemed entirely unfazed. He moved around the house as though nothing had changed, his demeanor as casual and unaffected as ever. It should have been reassuring, but instead, it only heightened my awareness of him. I started noticing things I hadn't before, like the way he ran a hand through his dark hair when he was deep in thought, the soft curve of his lips when he smiled at something on his phone, the way his voice carried a quiet confidence that felt far beyond his years. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, I caught a glimpse of him through the kitchen doorway. He was sitting in the living room, his long legs stretched out on the coffee table, scrolling absent-mindedly on his phone. The warm glow from the lamp cast a captivating light over his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the slight furrow of his brow. I couldn't help but stare, and my mind wandered to places it shouldn't. Shaking my head, I turned back to the stove, scolding myself for my foolishness. This was Caleb, my stepson, for heaven's sake. No matter how many times I reminded myself, the feelings wouldn't go away. In fact, they grew stronger, feeding off the quiet moments when my thoughts were left unchecked. Later that night, as I sat curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, Caleb wandered into the room. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair a bit tousled, as if he had just awakened from a nap. He gave me a small smile, one that felt oddly personal, and I felt my pulse quicken despite myself. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked playfully. "Something like that," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Something like that," he replied, settling onto the couch across from me. "What about you?" "Just unwinding," I said, gesturing to the wine glass in my hand. "Long day," he replied, a hint of exhaustion in his voice. He nodded, his gaze shifting to the glass in my hand before returning to me. "I'd love to join you." I hesitated for a moment, then shook my head. "Of course not." He disappeared into the kitchen and returned a moment later with a beer, settling back onto the couch. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional clink of his beer bottle against the coffee table. But the quiet wasn't as benign as it seemed. It felt charged, as though something unspoken hung in the air between us. "It's been absolutely wonderful having you here this summer," I said, brightening the atmosphere. The words felt a bit formal, but I was excited to see how this conversation would unfold. "Yeah," he said, our eyes meeting. "It's been great to be back. It's different, though." "How so?" I asked, eager to understand. Intrigued. He gave a casual shrug and took a sip of his beer. "I don't know. Just different." His words resonated with me more intensely than expected, igniting a deep, thrilling response within. I was on the verge of asking him more about it, but I was also excited to see where the conversation would lead. As the evening stretched on, the space between us seemed to shrink, creating an intimacy that felt electric. He shifted on the couch, leaning forward slightly, and I felt his gaze on me, steady and unwavering. It wasn't the gaze of a boy. It was the gaze of a man, and it made my breath catch in my throat. "I've missed just being around you," he said suddenly, his voice soft yet firm. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I was at a loss for words. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as nothing more than a casual comment. But another part of me, a part one was excited to embrace, wanted to lean into it, to see where it might lead. "Me too," I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room felt electrically charged, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, he leaned back, his expression unreadable. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered, pressing down on me long after he'd gone upstairs. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, the way his voice had softened when he spoke to me. It wasn't just the words. It was the feeling behind them, the quiet intensity that left no room for doubt. Something had shifted between us, and I knew there was no going back. The days that followed were filled with moments of connection, fleeting but powerful. Each interaction felt like a delicate dance, filled with a deep and profound connection that went beyond what was said. I found myself seeking out his presence, craving the way his attention made me feel alive, desired, seen. As time went on, the tension between us grew, making every moment more thrilling than the last. It was a delicate dance, held together by the most fragile of threads, ready to snap at any moment. I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before something, or someone, would force it to break. The palpable tension between Caleb and me was captivating, and I couldn't help but be drawn to it. It followed me everywhere, alive in the silence of the house, pressing against me during the moments that might otherwise have been mundane, like folding laundry or preparing dinner. Every glance, every word exchanged between us felt heavier than it should, as if we were both holding on to something unsaid, something unspoken but palpable. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a palpable presence that filled the room whenever we were together, and even when we weren't. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. James was working late again, his absence now a predictable part of our routine. I had convinced myself I was used to it, that the solitude was a comfort rather than a void. But that night, the silence felt different. It was charged, expectant. Caleb had been upstairs most of the evening, his footsteps barely audible above the hum of the air conditioner. I reminded myself that it was better this way, that avoiding him was the smartest thing to do. And yet, the very thought of him lingered in my mind, pulling at me like a thread unraveling a tightly wound spool. I dived into the kitchen, giving the countertops my undivided attention. The rhythm of the task was soothing, a welcome distraction from the storm brewing inside me. But then I heard his footsteps descending the stairs, slow and deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, the cloth in my hand hovering mid-swipe. When I turned, there he was, standing in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the hallway light. "Hey," he said, his voice low and casual, but there was something in his tone that made the air feel heavier. "Hey," I replied, trying not to smile too much. "Couldn't sleep," he said, a hint of sleepiness in his voice, as he stepped into the kitchen. "Thought I'd grab some water," he added, a playful gleam in his eye. I nodded, intrigued, and watched as he moved to the fridge. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and loose pajama pants, his hair slightly tousled, as if he'd just rolled out of bed. There was an easy confidence in his movement, and it made my chest tighten with anticipation. I turned back to the counter, pretending to finish wiping it down, but I was acutely aware of every movement he made behind me. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" he asked suddenly, his voice a warm blend of curiosity and invitation. His question caught me by surprise. I turned to look at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I mean, with James gone all the time, doesn't it get lonely?" His honesty was disarming, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I guess I've gotten used to it," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't respond right away, his eyes searching mine as if trying to read the thoughts I wasn't saying out loud. There was a silent agreement between us, a quiet understanding that neither of us dared to verbalize. "I don't think you should have to get used to it," he said finally, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite identify. Concern, maybe, or something deeper. I looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "Life isn't always what we want it to be," I said, turning back to the counter. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the cloth, and I prayed he didn't notice. "Sometimes it can be," he said, his voice now much closer to mine. I hadn't heard him move, but when I turned, he was standing just a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine. The space between us felt impossibly small, the air thick with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I felt my mouth part as if to say something, but no words came out. "Karen," he said softly, my name sounding different when he said it, like it carried more weight than it should. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Caleb, we can't," I started, but the words caught in my throat. "I know," he said, cutting me off. I don't want you to feel like you're alone." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. I turned away, embarrassed by the surge of emotions. But then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through me that made it impossible to ignore the pull between us. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything." I leaned in, embracing the warmth of his hand against mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like the walls I'd built around myself were beginning to crumble. But just as quickly as the moment came, I pulled back, stepping away and putting space between us. "You should go to bed," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. "It's late." He hesitated, his eyes searching mine once more before nodding. "Good night," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or longing. "Good night," I replied, watching as he turned and left the kitchen. When he was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. The room felt empty without him, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, leaving me reeling. I knew I had to draw a line before it went too far. As I told myself this, I felt my body hum with the memory of his touch, and my mind kept replaying the look in his eyes. I stood there in the silence, the coolness of the counter beneath my hands grounding me as I tried to make sense of what I was feeling. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something that terrified me because it felt so real. In that moment, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the lines we were tiptoeing around wouldn't hold forever. Something had to give, and when it did, I wasn't sure either of us would be ready for what came next, but I was excited for the possibilities. The living room was bathed in a soft golden light from the table lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. I had just poured myself a second glass of wine, hoping its warmth might ease the weight of the day. James was away again, on another late-night meeting or something equally exciting, leaving the house silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was used to this stillness, this comforting quiet, but tonight it felt different, heavier, like the quiet was pressing in on me from all sides. I heard Caleb's footsteps before I saw him, soft and unhurried as they descended the stairs. My pulse quickened involuntarily, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. He appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. He looked casual, almost careless, in a fitted black t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy, as though he'd been running his fingers through it. There was something effortless about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room the moment he entered. "Still awake?" he asked, his voice low and calm as his eyes met mine. I nodded, lifting the glass in my hand as though it explained everything. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, my tone more casual than I felt. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, a playful smile playing on his lips. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the couch across from me. "I could use the company." He strolled over and nestled into the cushions, his movements fluid and unhurried. He stretched out his legs, one arm draping lazily along the back of the couch. His presence immediately transformed the energy in the room, making it feel more intimate and cozy. I took a slow sip of my wine, hoping it would steady the racing of my heart. "Long day?" he asked, his gaze steady and unrelenting. I nodded, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Something like that. And you? What's keeping you up?" He shrugged, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I just felt like being up and about. I didn't think anyone else would be." There was something about the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, that made the air feel charged. I shifted in my seat, suddenly hyper-aware of the hem of my dress brushing against my thighs, the way the wine glass felt cool against my fingertips. We sat in silence for a moment, relishing the intimate connection we had created. The air hung thick with anticipation, and I felt a tingle of excitement at the prospect of what might come next. It was the kind of silence that felt full of potential, like a single word could change the course of the night. I felt his gaze on me, steady and unflinching, and it made my skin prickle with a warmth that I welcomed. "I've missed this," he said suddenly, his voice soft but deliberate. "Missed what?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely to the space between us. "Just talking, spending time together." His honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I've missed it too," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile, though small and shy, belied the intensity in his eyes. "You don't have to be alone, you know," he said, his tone more serious now. "You don't deserve that." His words hit me harder than I expected, stirring something deep inside me that I wasn't ready to face. "Caleb," I started, but he interrupted me. "I mean it," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You're incredible, and I hate that you don't see it." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing. I wanted to dismiss his words, to brush them off as meaningless flattery. But the way he looked at me, the raw sincerity in his voice, made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't just saying it, he believed it. For the first time in ages, I felt understood. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're welcome," he replied. The room felt absolutely still, the only sound the faint clink of my wine glass as I set it down on the table. My heart was racing, and my skin tingled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. I felt an urge to break the silence, to do something to lighten the mood, but I couldn't find the words. Then, to my surprise, Caleb stood up, and I thought for a moment he was going to leave. But then, to my surprise, he strolled over to me, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped right in front of me, his eyes fixed on me with a depth that made my breath catch in my throat. "Good night, Karen," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night," I replied, my voice trembling with excitement. He paused, as if he had more to say, then turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the silence of the house. I sat there for a long time after he left, relishing the lingering weight of his words and the look in his eyes. I reminded myself that it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. I couldn't stop thinking about what might come next, and as much as I tried to push it away, I was excited. The silence between Caleb and me had grown palpable, like a taut string stretched to its breaking point. Days had gone by since that quiet moment in the living room, but its echoes lingered in the air, reverberating in every glance, every accidental brush of skin as we moved around the house. I barely noticed James's absence, but Caleb's presence was a whole other story. He was everywhere, and no matter how much I tried to avoid him, I couldn't escape the pull he had over me. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual. A summer storm rumbled in the distance, the low growl of thunder punctuating the stillness. I sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of me, staring out the window at the darkening sky. My thoughts were a vibrant tapestry of emotions, a kaleidoscope of feelings intertwined with guilt, longing, and a mysterious element I couldn't fully identify. The rain began softly at first, a gentle patter against the windows, and then escalated into a steady downpour that blurred the world outside. Caleb entered the room quietly, his presence as comforting and reassuring now as the storm outside. He was barefoot, his jeans slightly damp from venturing outside earlier, and his long hair fell in front of his eyes. His shirt clung to him in places, and a strand of dark hair fell across his forehead, giving him an almost boyish look that contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes as he glanced at me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low but steady, as though he already knew the answer. I nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. "Just thinking," I said, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. I hesitated, but only for a second. "Sure," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. He took a seat, and the table felt smaller, the space between us charged with anticipation. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of the rain filling the air, creating a soothing backdrop to the storm brewing within me. I could feel his steady, unrelenting eyes on me, and I took a deep breath, willing myself not to meet his gaze. "You've been quiet lately," he said finally, breaking the silence. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "So have you," I replied, my voice warm and playful. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as though trying to decipher a puzzle. "I don't know how to say this without making it weird," he began, his voice careful and deliberate. "Then maybe don't say it," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. I immediately regretted it, but there was no taking back my words. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's already weird, Karen," he said simply, his honesty cutting through the air like a blade. I looked away, unable to face the truth in his words. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The rain outside grew in intensity, its sound matching the rhythm of my racing pulse. I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, closing the distance between us. "You do," he said softly, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "You feel it too. Don't pretend you don't." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, to tell him he was wrong. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered, made me realize that I couldn't lie. "Caleb, this is—" I trailed off, my voice faltering as I searched for the right words. "This is complicated." "It doesn't have to be," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through me that made it impossible to think clearly. His fingers lingered for a moment, his touch warm and steady, before he pulled back, as though giving me space to decide. "It's not that simple," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Maybe it is," he countered, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't ready to give. "Maybe we're just making it harder than it needs to be." I looked down at my hands, my fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the table. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the intensity of his presence filling the room. Outside, the rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, the thunder rumbling in the distance like a fading echo. "I can't," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't do this." He stood, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave. But instead, he walked around the table and stopped in front of me, his towering frame casting a shadow over me. He crouched down, his hands resting on the edge of my chair, his face level with mine. "You're not alone, Karen," he said softly, his voice steady and calm. "You don't have to be." His words struck me like a bolt of inspiration, shattering the walls I had built up around myself. I was overwhelmed with gratitude, and for a moment, I let myself believe him, let myself feel the warmth of his presence, the sincerity in his voice. But the weight of reality came crashing down around me, pulling me back to the surface. "I need you to go," I said, my voice trembling as I looked away. Please. He paused, his gaze fixed on me, and then he took a step back. If that's what you want, he said quietly. It is, I said, though the words felt hollow in my chest. He nodded, his expression unreadable as he turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving me alone once again. The rain had stopped, and the silence of the house only added to the palpable connection between us. I sat there for what felt like hours, relishing the weight of his words and the look in his eyes. I had done the right thing, I told myself. This was better this way. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. I felt a surge of hope, knowing that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The house was bathed in an eerie stillness, a silence that felt purposefully crafted. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards were the only sounds, creating an intriguing tension in the air. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving the night unusually quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I was standing in the living room, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the darkened window, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, desire, and something far more dangerous: hope. It wasn't supposed to come to this. I had told myself time and time again that I could keep things under control, that the unspoken tension between Caleb and me would dissipate if I just ignored it. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, it kept creeping back, stronger and more insistent, until it was impossible to pretend otherwise. Every glance, every word, every fleeting touch had built to this moment, and now there was no turning back. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the soft thud of his bare feet against the wooden floor. My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt a rush of excitement as I turned to see him standing in the doorway. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and gray sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled, as though he'd just woken up. His presence filled the room, making the air feel heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. "You're still awake," he said, his voice low and steady, but there was a quiet intensity in it that sent a shiver down my spine. "So am I," I replied, my voice as soft as a whisper. My hands gripped the edge of the windowsill, as though anchoring myself against the pull of his gaze. "I couldn't sleep," he said, stepping into the room. "I couldn't sleep," he said, a playful gleam in his eyes. "I was thinking about earlier." His words hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken, my skin prickling with awareness. I turned away, pretending to focus on the rain-speckled glass, but I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unrelenting. "We shouldn't be having this conversation," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," he agreed, his tone soft but insistent. "But we both know it's been building for a long time." I turned to face him, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the look in his eyes. Unwavering, intense, and entirely unapologetic. It was the kind of look that left no room for doubt, that stripped away every pretense and laid bare the truth neither of us wanted to admit. "Caleb, this is wrong," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "You know that." "I know," he said, taking a step closer. "But it doesn't change how I feel. Or how you feel." His words were a thrilling challenge, daring me to deny what we both knew was true. I felt my mouth open as if to protest, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself captivated, mesmerized by the gravitational pull of his presence. He stopped right in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin and smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it, and my hands trembled as I tried to keep my composure. "Karen," he said softly, my name sounding different when it came from him, softer, more intimate. "Tell me you don't feel it, and I'll walk away." I stared at him, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I wanted to tell him no, to end this before it went any further. But the truth was I couldn't. I felt it, every unspoken word, every lingering glance, every electric touch that had passed between us. It was undeniable and inescapable, no matter how much I wished it wasn't. "I can't," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me that made it impossible to think clearly. His touch was gentle, tentative, as though he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air so thick it was almost suffocating. He moved closer, his hand trailing up my arm, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. My skin tingled with anticipation, and I felt a heat rise within me that I hadn't felt in years. "This is dangerous," I whispered, though I made no move to stop him. "I know," he said, his voice low and steady, "but it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" His voice was like a knife, cutting through every rational thought I had left. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't resist. I knew that, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he looked at me, the way his touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in so long. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but it was no use. Every nerve in my body was on edge, every thought consumed by the weight of his presence. When his hand moved to cup my cheek, I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into his touch, the warmth of his palm grounding me even as it set my heart racing. "Tell me to stop," he said softly, his breath warm against my skin. I opened my eyes and met his gaze, and the look in his eyes took my breath away. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something raw and real that I wasn't ready to face. But I didn't tell him to stop. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both hesitant and full of longing. It was a kiss that spoke volumes, revealing all the things we had been longing to express, all the things we had been holding back for so long. In that moment, I felt like I was finally free, like I could be myself, and like nothing could stop me. When we finally pulled apart, the room was silent, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the window. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely, terrifyingly alive. But as the reality of what had just happened began to settle in, so did the weight of what it meant. There was no turning back, no pretending that this hadn't changed everything. Despite my desire to relish every moment, to immerse myself in the warmth of his embrace, I understood that life would carry on. Nothing ever is.